Hey everybody, it's Word Balloon and John Suntress. A couple show notes before we get started. Questions or comments about the show, john@wordballoon.com is my email address. You may want to scroll down because you might have missed a couple great episodes from the last week or so. People like Tim Seeley, Wonder Woman, Susan Eisenberg from Justice League Unlimited, Frank Conniff from Mystery Science Theater 3000. My buddy Steve Bryant has a Kickstarter on a crime comic, The Catch. A new Bendis tapes is in there. Also, my buddy Julianne Emery, the actress, talks about the new season of Bosch debuting Friday on Amazon Prime. Also, Declan Shelvey and my buddy DC publicist, editor, and First Comics, Mike Gold, a great two-parter about the Bronze Age. I hope you'll check those all out. And as always, thank you very much for listening to the show all the way through. Thank you for listening to the commercials. It's one of the ways that I get paid. There might be one more commercial before we start the show. If there is, hang in there, and we'll be back in a few seconds with more great Word Balloon programming. Thanks for your attention. Hey everybody, welcome back to Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. I am happy to welcome documentarian Ken Viola to today's show. In 1987, Ken made this incredible documentary called Masters of Comic Book Art. It featured amazing creators like Neal Adams, Steve Ditko, Will Eisner, Art Spiegelman. Harlan Ellison was the narrator. Jean Giraud, Mobius, Jack Kirby, Harvey Kurtzman, Frank Miller, Dave Sim, and Bernie Wrightson. It was a great look at comics at the moment. It featured those past masters and current hot artists and writers. It was great. And we talk about this documentary because we're going to be doing a review, a live stream of it, Thursday night, the 16th, here on Word Balloon with Tom King and my buddy Mike Cronenberg, who does a lot of work with Tomorrows, putting together their magazines. A fantastic artist. He also made the Batcave companion for Tomorrows, a look at Batman creators. Ken emails me and says, hey, I hear you're going to be talking about my movie. Would you like to talk to me? Yes, I would, because I knew there were some incredible stories of how Ken got to these creators, was able to do these interviews with him. It was a great time, too, because, again, this was 1987, so it was around the time of Watchmen, Dark Knight Returns, and Mouse. This was purely an independent project, and Ken gives us his background and what happened leading up to creating this incredible movie. It's on YouTube. I recommend you watch it, especially if you're interested in joining our discussion tonight on the live stream with Tom and Mike as we talk about this movie. But great stories. He also had a very interesting music career, and we talk about that as well. It was a real pleasure to get to know Ken Viola and more about his movie, Masters of Comic Book Art, on today's Word Balloon. All brought to you by the League of Word Balloon listeners. Thank you greatly, League, for your support via Patreon, patreon.com/wordballoon. If you like Word Balloon, you like what you hear here, and I know these are crazy times, but, if you can help me out and subscribe to Word Balloon, that'd be great. Word Balloon is free. It'll always be free. But if you can help the cause, go to patreon.com/wordballoon. Thank you greatly, League of Word Balloon listeners. And Word Balloon is also brought to you by Aftershock Comics. These are crazy times, and Aftershock asks you to help out with your local comic book store. Give them a call and see what's in their back catalog that you might find interesting, and you might find an Aftershock book there. There are great genre-bending titles from Aftershock that are worthy of your attention, from great creators, too, like Tim Seeley and Stephanie Phillips and Cullen Bunn and Marguerite Bennett, Garth Ennis, Paul Jenkins. So many great people that have been on Word Balloon, and they are now writing and drawing for Aftershock Comics and making great comics you won't believe. Go to their website. You will find full story descriptions, preview art pages, and the way to order these books digitally at AftershockComics.com. All right, let's get into it now. Great talk with Ken Viola, talking about an amazing documentary from 1987, The Masters of Comic Book Art. Again, you can find it on YouTube, and we talk about that. How does Ken feel about a product that he was selling and that's now been thrown up on YouTube for people to watch? We get into it and a lot more in this conversation with Ken Viola on today's Word Balloon. Ken Viola, welcome to Word Balloon. Dude, I really appreciate you reaching out and us having this conversation.
Yes, Word Balloon is definitely one of the most vital things that's happening in online comics talk and study. So it's an honor.
Jesus, I'm really pleased that you know who I am and what I've been doing. That's great, man. Thank you. I'll tell you, man, and forgive me for dating both of us, but I remember very clearly in the 80s seeing VCR copies of your movie playing in direct market stores. let's get to the beginning. What made you want to do this documentary?
Well, I'm pretty much a lifelong comic book fan, starting when my grandfather gave me one of the Batman strange, weird comics in the mid-1950s when I was probably 4 or 5 years old. And that kind of set the tone for my appreciation and interest in comics. And I started reading them at that young an age, and read all of the Atlas comics, and when the DC and then later on the Marvel line started, I was in on it, as a child. So always been into it. I published a couple of comic book fanzines in the mid to late '60s, and that was fun.
What were the titles of your fanzines?
Critique was the comic book fanzine that people could possibly know about, and I grew up in Hackensack, New Jersey, which is about 7 miles west of New York City.
Okay.
So I was able to make it in to the first comic book conventions. There weren't many people there at all.
That's awesome, man. These are Phil Seuling's, right?
Yeah,
and he the guy who kind of organized those? Excellent, man. That's
great.
There
was one, I think there was one before Phil that he perhaps did not organize, the first one. I can't remember. But anyway, I had correspondence with a lot of great comic book fans, many of whom, went into the field, and later on, and I also made a lot of friends. I think at the second or third convention, I became friends with Bernie Wrightson,
awesome,
who had came up from, I think he came up from Baltimore, if I'm not mistaken. He came up with another artist from Virginia, and anyway, and then I also made friends with a guy who then was known as Gene Klein, and he wrote for my fanzine, and I wrote for his, and he later on turned out to be Gene Simmons and Kiss.
Ha!
And we used to talk on the phone, and took the bus in and met each other in the city, that kind of thing. We also had a mutual love of music, so that was good as well. So I wanted to become a comic book writer, and this is when I was in junior high school.
Okay.
So I went and tried to figure out how I could do that. At the time, there was a tour of the DC offices that you could take.
Yep.
And so I went on a bunch of those, and almost nobody was on those, but Marv Wolfman and Len Wein and Irene Vantnoff and Mark Hannerfeld. They were at almost every one. But
did you get original? I had heard that after the tour they would give people like half pages of actual art and stuff. Did you get any of that?
I never saw that happen. But I didn't go all that much, not as much as the other people I mentioned, but sure. I never experienced that. Okay. But I did get put in front of all of the DC editors at one time or another. which was a very, very interesting experience.
Rattle off some names for people they might recognize if they're, Silver Age fans.
Jules Schwartz.
Sure.
Mort Weisinger.
Of course.
Robert Canninger.
Awesome.
At one point, when Carmine Infantino, this is a little bit later, became, what was he, the publisher? Or,
yeah.
Yeah. I was put in front of him. Later still, Joe Orlando, when he was a editor there.
Oh, yeah.
And each of those experiences was unique, and because the personalities were so diverse. And
what would they talk about on the tour? I've never really gone into detail with someone who's been on the tours and stuff. What would they say?
Well, they wouldn't say just about anything, but it was more or less a way to come inside. And they would say, this is so-and-so's office. This is his office. This is the, Nelson Bridwell was the production department guy. And,
sure.
Things like that. They weren't as formal as it sounds, but anyway, it was interesting.
Were there art? Was there pages on the walls? Were there books already
Nope.
on? I know about Stan Lee's office would have a magazine rack on it, and he'd always have the current last published issues basically facing him in his office and stuff. Anything like that?
So I went to Marvel numerous times, and
okay,
and essentially they wouldn't let you in.
Interesting.
But and the offices were really small. DC had much larger offices.
Would you see like Flo Steinberg? Was she like in
yes.
front? She was hilarious, fabulous Flo, man. Stan secretary. That's awesome.
She was so nice. In fact, she was probably the nicest person in relation to the two different companies.
This is what I've heard, and that she always was like great to the fans. That's awesome. Go on.
Yeah, she was terrific. I did get a couple of letters back from Stan for when I submitted a couple of things, and they were nice, but nothing too much. The best thing is one of the times when I went to Marvel, I happened to run into Jack Kirby.
There you go.
He just happened to be there. And, I recognized him, and I don't know why or how. I don't remember,
Yeah.
But I, said, Jack Kirby, and I introduced myself. He ended up talking to me for a few hours.
Wow.
And, we really hit it off. And, we were in touch a little bit after that. He was working like all the time, but he would come in, I think, to drop off his stuff or whatever. And, but the best thing of all is one day I was looking through the phone book to try to figure out, again, some kind of path to getting involved, and lo and behold, I came upon Steve Ditko's telephone number.
Wow.
Which was published.
Yeah.
And I called him, and that started the biggest relationship that I had with any of these people. Started with a bunch of phone calls, and then phone calls and letters. And then eventually he let me come up to the studio maybe, I don't know, half a dozen times.
Wow.
And this is over the period of about probably 5 or 6 years or so. And he was just fantastic. I mean, Jack was great too. But Steve was just, he kind of, in a way, took me under his wing, so to speak, sort of like a big brother.
Wow.
I was like the oldest child in my family, and so he kind of was like my big brother in a way. A lot of advice and great talks, and just about practical, logical things, not necessarily all about comics, although there was a lot of comic book content. And so he was the first one to explain to me how comics were written, that there were, two different styles, one being a script that had a line down the center, and on the left were the stage directions or the panel descriptions, and on the right was the captions and the dialogues.
Okay.
A dialogue rather. And and then he said the other system, which was just somebody would describe a story in the briefest terms, and then the artist would just do the pages and give them back to the writer at that point. And Steve preferred, he never liked captions, and he preferred he liked the challenge of a good script, and he really liked Joe Gill, who he worked with at Charlton.
Sure.
And his scripts, and he gave me several of his scripts as examples.
Wow.
So I could see what he was talking about.
I've had I want to stop for a second about Joe Gill because he fascinates me. Tell people what Joe Gill's day job was while he was churning out comics.
Oh, I don't even know.
Oh, you're kidding? Oh, he was the policeman. He was the policeman in Connecticut.
Oh, wow.
And he was kind of freelancing and obviously didn't want, or no, excuse me, it wasn't Joe Gill. Shame on me. Say this is Pete Morrissey, I believe. Pete Morrissey.
Okay.
Maybe it was Pete Morrissey who would, I'm going to have to go look and see which of them it was again. But Joe Gill wrote so many Charlton comics. Yeah. I mean, he really was like the backbone of Charlton.
I find it hard to believe that he had another job, maybe, but it's always possible.
Again, I'm sure I'm confusing Pete and Joe right now with the cop story. Regardless, literally like 80 or 90% of what Charlton put out were Joe Gill scripts, so that's amazing.
Yeah, so Steve was amazing. Such a normal person too. I know everybody says, "Oh, he was so mysterious, and he was this, and he was that," and he was none of those things.
Well, okay, yeah, because he's like the J.D. Salinger of comics.
Well, yeah, I know he has that reputation, but if you really look at it, if people wrote him letters, he answered all their letters. He didn't, if people called him, he talked to them. Not all the time because he had to work,
Sure.
Also, but, what his thing was that he felt that the work, his work said it all. And essentially that should be enough. He wasn't into fame of any kind whatsoever. He came from, I think, Johnstown, Pennsylvania, if I'm not mistaken. And he, so he came from that, environment, and then he came to New York, to become a comic book artist. And he studied, I think, under Jerry Robinson, if I'm right, and I'm pretty sure I am. But that was his thing. He was an artist, and as Jack Kirby said to me many years later, Steve is an intellectual, and Kirby was in awe of Ditko.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'll take a moment because I really think that Steve's segment in your documentary, while we're talking about him, is the most fascinating because it's him kind of reading, and forgive the description, a manifesto of sorts, explaining his philosophies, not on camera, and again, like you said, allowing the work to speak for it, although, it's great that you got him at least to be on the documentary from a voice standpoint. So, yeah, that's the most unique segment of your documentary. So.
Yeah, cool. Thanks. That was a lot of fun to do. He did not give me any direction as far as what to show. So, essentially what happened was, I wanted him to be involved because, his thing was he was most proud of his storytelling ability. Sure. And he, at the beginning when we're jumping ahead, but at the beginning when I first wanted to do this, because I wanted to be a comic book writer way back, and started to become a comic book writer, I kind of felt that Masters of Comic Book Art should be about how comics were made. And, because if you look at the different eras of comics, the EC comic artists, the art far outshone the writing, right?
Yes.
And the storytelling of the EC artists was amazing. And, so there was that, right? And then later on, it got to be a different thing where I think that the editors, had more control over how the stuff came out. Mm-hmm. And then, by the time I got to do Masters of Comic Book Art in the mid '80s, we were at a point where the comic book artists who wrote and drew their own stuff was kind of what was happening, at that period.
Yes.
And after that period was over, and right up to the present day, I think it's been more of a writer's, field.
I understand. Sure.
In a lot of ways, even though, obviously, the artist's contribution is vital and important. And if a writer does great work and teams up with a fantastic artist, then the results are, bigger than the both of them,
Agreed. I think in the 90s, it felt like the art became the most important thing. And frankly, in my opinion, I think the story kind of suffered for it with the image explosion and all, those great artists that came from that. It was really more about the amazing visuals, and then the story was kind of secondary. But I do think you're right in terms of the last 20 years, starting in the very late 90s, writers began to dominate again. And then I think it depends on the team. Because, and again, I told you that I'm going to be talking about your movie with Tom King, and I know that whenever he has artists, they're very much involved in the plotting and what they want to do. And I know Scott Snyder, when he works with Greg Capullo, another great example of a guy who, kind of wants Greg to feel as represented as possible with the stories and everything. But anyway, we're a tangent and everything. But so, let's go back to your story. We can, or we can finish talking about Ditko's contribution in particular. So when you approached him, was he like, oh, sure? Or,
yeah.
Again, he didn't show himself on camera. So did you try to shoot him? And then he was like, no, I can't do that. What happened in terms of developing the segment that you got?
So what happened was we had not been in touch for, quite a while, because once I, which we won't go into here, but once I decided that trying to write comic books at that point was not for me, mainly because of the editors, by the way.
Okay.
and what they were about and how they acted. I went into the music business instead, which was my other interest.
Yep.
And that's how that did all my work. I did all my work in that business until I retired a couple of years ago. But
wow, now and I'm reading your IMDb page. You were a roadie for Eric Clapton?
I know that's on there. That's so funny. That's absolutely not true.
Well, what did you? I mean, because again, looking at your page,
yeah,
I saw that you were, involved with the TV series Rock Influence, and Carla DeVito was part of that show.
Yes.
And,
so
hey, man, I remember. Again, I'm 55, so I remember. I'm only a few years younger than you. I remember "Is This a Cool World?" her great song, and she was terrific. So.
Yeah.
What period were you working in rock, and what did you do in music?
So I was working in rock at the same time in the late '60s. I was trying to make records. I was writing songs. I did make a few records. Nothing really notable at that period. But then, as a weird adjunct to that, I started working at shows in the New York, New Jersey area.
Okay.
Figuring I could meet people, which I did, and I kind of stayed there, and I started doing security at concerts. And,
oh, that's awesome.
And I became really, really good at it, and I had a career. Now, I did do some other stuff as well. For a while, I was in management. I designed some album covers. I hired Bernie Wrightson to paint a Meatloaf album cover.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Which album cover did Bernie do for Meatloaf?
Dead Ringer was the name of the album. It was the follow-up album to Bat Out of Hell.
Oh, that's awesome, man. Fantastic. Yeah. Well, certain people were paying attention to that. That's great, man.
Yeah. And I was in management, for a while also.
Drop some rock names. Drop some other rock names of people you were in contact with during this period.
I did work with Bruce Springsteen and Southside Johnny.
Wow. Oh, man, Southside Johnny and the Asbury Jukes. Absolutely, man.
Yeah, and then for many decades, I was the head of security for the Grateful Dead.
Wow, crazy.
Yeah.
Oh, my God. Good Lord, man. That's worth several interviews in itself. Good. I mean, being on tour with the Dead and that experience of live Dead shows and stuff. Good Lord, that's fantastic.
Yeah, and then Jerry Garcia was a huge comic book fan. When he first made any money, the first thing he did was he went out and he bought a complete set of EC comics.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
go on about Jerry.
And he also credits Harvey Kurtzman and Will Elder's Mad Comics as one of the seminal influences in putting him in the direction that he went in.
That's amazing. I worked at the rock station in Chicago, WXRT, for 10 years, and I was there when Jerry passed away.
Yeah.
And we ran the Grateful Dead Hour on Sunday nights. That was one of our staple, shows. And and I mean, I never met anyone from the Dead, but our program director Norm Weiner, who started in Boston and made his way to Chicago, he certainly knew the band quite well. All the DJs knew the band quite well. Mm-hmm. And it was definitely a sad day in the mid '90s when Jerry passed away.
Yeah. Him and I were very good friends. We met in the late '60s and stayed friends, right through the end. So
wow.
Anyway, So I did a bunch of things, in the music business, and then when I wasn't doing those specific things, or when I came home between tours or whatnot, I worked all the local shows in the area. So I worked with virtually every act that there was at one time or another, including Eric Clapton. But I don't know where they got that from. but I think I'm not sure where they got it from. But anyway, so at one point, around the mid-'80s, I became the associate producer of the very first MTV series, which was called Rock Influences. It was 2 seasons. Both seasons got nominated for an ACE Award.
Sure, the old cable award. Yes, yes.
Yeah. And what we did was we took live concerts that we put on with relevant acts who hosted the show, and we had subject matter, and then we had archival footage, and we sort of did like a little, live music and footage history of whatever we were exploring, and it was a lot of fun.
Is that show available at all on DVD or anything?
I don't think so. No, I don't think
well, maybe the rights would be a nightmare to try and clear it.
Probably
to get made today.
Yeah, probably. But,
so is that where you learned? Is that where you learned your kind of filmmaking?
Yes.
Chops and everything. Okay.
Yes. So when that was over, I had several relationships with different entities, and a few of them said to me, "Well, what do you want to do next?" And I said, "I want to make a film about comic book artists." And they were all very enthusiastic, believe it or not. And so I set about making the film. And the first person that I approached was Bernie Wrightson, because we had just, a few years before done the Meatloaf album cover and that kind of thing, and gotten back in touch with each other. And, so he said yes. And so once he said yes, then I had, the wherewithal to go to people that I knew from a long time ago, and ask them if they wanted to be involved. And I think I went to Ditko Next, and he said yes right away.
That's great.
So he wrote his essay and sent it to me, and I read it, and I said, "Boy, this is fantastic."
Yeah.
This says it all. It's going to go over the heads of most of the people, but it's great. And I said, so I want to come in and film you and this and that. And he said, well, I don't want to be on camera. And I said, okay, well then I'll just come in and record the audio. And he said, well, what'll be on the screen? I said, well, let me think about that. And so I did, and I know how proud he was of Mr. A.
Yeah.
Even though, again, most people that talk about Mr. A, all they want to focus on is, the Ayn Rand, thing, and
objectivism. Am I saying the
yes,
thinking properly? Okay, very good. Yes, indeed. Well, it is fascinating, and in some ways seem to be an extension of. Did you ever ask them about the connection between, say, The Question and Mr. A?
No, we never talked about that. That connection, but when I had first met him, he gave me a copy of The Fountainhead
sure.
to read.
I read the book, absolutely, yes.
I loved it, and then I read Atlas Shrugged.
Yep.
And I know that he attended courses or speeches that Ayn Rand gave at the Empire State Building.
Wow.
He went all the time, and he loved that. He loved her work.
Yeah, well, and for people, there's a YouTube interview with Ayn Rand and I believe Mike Wallace from Mike Wallace's pre-60 Minutes show from the late 50s. Also, a place where he interviewed Rod Serling, and they're very interesting half-hour interviews. Yeah.
Yeah. So No, but I know how proud he was of Mr. A. So I thought about it, and I said, well, I'll just take, examples of Mr. A stories, and, I'll just use those. And he was like, oh, great,
That's awesome. Yeah.
So, and at one point, I was trying to shoot all originals, figuring that would be the best, but it turned out that didn't work out, and the best stuff that I shot was stuff that ended up being on like better white paper,
Okay.
in terms of contrast and stuff.
Sure.
But Ditko gave me all kinds of art, as did most of the people, until I went away from that idea. And I tried shooting it, and then I gave it all back, and that kind of thing. But yeah, I was very proud of that segment and the fact that he was in it, and he liked the film.
That's great. That's excellent, man. Well, everybody liked the film that I know, man, because again, it was sitting in every direct market store that I was in Chicago, and a lot of them were playing the video on a TV behind the counter and everything, and we're all not buying comics, we're watching your movie, man. It was amazing.
Well, that's good to hear, but what's interesting about that comment is, so I financed the thing myself, and I had a business plan, and the business plan was, I thought, pretty good. It had multiple ways of at least breaking even, if not making, some money, but I didn't do it for that reason, I have to say. I did it more for the reason of trying to, do something like this, which, hadn't been done. And, my thing was kind of like the first one.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I had sold a bunch of the Rock Influences things, like concerts, without the theme and the archival footage, to public television.
Okay.
And so I spoke to them, and I had a good relationship with them. I spoke to them before I made the film and explained to them exactly what the film was going to be like and what it was about and that kind of thing. And they were extremely enthusiastic. And I talked to lots of people in the comic book business, distributors and stores and, publications and things like that, and they were all super enthusiastic. And of course, there was the thing of, oh, comics are so successful over in Europe,
right,
and Japan, and I didn't know a whole lot about that, to be honest. But anyway, I just thought, listen, at the time, I forget how many comic shops there were, but, there was quite a few. And I thought to myself, well, every comic shop has to buy one of these that they can, like, show in their store, like you just said, or rent to their customers or whatnot,
Sure.
And so none of that happened.
Wow.
By the way, none of it happened. It was interesting.
So a lot of lip service, but no distribution deals emerged?
Nothing.
Wow.
So it was wild. So initially, obviously, I was extremely disappointed. Well, yeah. But and I took out, full page ads in the Comics Buyer's Guide, and, Bud Plant, offered to distribute it, and, I forget who else right now. That's when there were multiple distributors.
Certainly. Yeah.
And, I knew there was going to be, write-ups and, all kind of things. PBS was very disappointing because they turned it down. So anyway, so I said, well, now I got to roll up my sleeves and really get to work. So the first thing that I did, which was interesting, was I went to big comic book stores in New York City, and I said, I'm going to leave you on consignment, copies of this. And, you sell them. You don't sell them, I'll take them back. Pay me later. And it was hugely successful.
Uh-oh.
So,
So was it legitimately, did you see money, or I'm fearing the likelihood that, the thing got pirated a bunch?
Well, no, actually it didn't get pirated, which was good.
Yeah.
at least that I knew. I don't think so. But anyway, it showed me that, something was not happening with distribution and, comic book stores being able to handle or think of something that wasn't comic books,
Interesting. Go on. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but yet I had so much success in New York City selling this thing that, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of copies,
That's fantastic. That's great, man.
So, but I couldn't get that going anywhere else. And I went out to San Diego, and, I bought a table and
Comic-Con, sure.
And all of that. And again, there was no reaction.
Weird.
It was really weird, John. So anyway, right at the point where I was going to go, I said, well, libraries have to be into this,
Sure.
So I started pursuing that route, the way that, one did that, which was through the book distributors. There was 2 huge book distributors that distributed everything to stores and libraries. And so I contacted them and went through that, and again, nothing.
Would they give you feedback back in terms of why, or was it just silence, nothing?
No, silence.
Okay.
I'd find, I do what I had to do as far as, take out an ad, one of them, and I can't remember the name of the distributor right now, but they were massive, even put it on the cover of their monthly, magazine.
Sure.
And did an article about it. So anyway, I was getting pretty upset about this.
Yeah.
And just when that was happening, Rhino came along and said, you know what, we'll distribute this for you. And
this is still reasonably after you had already made the movie? Is this within 87, 88, around that, or was it years later?
It was 1990, I think.
God damn. That late in the game.
So
wow.
3 years later or something. So Rhino took it over, and they bought all my remaining stock, and they also put out a new version of it. And we experimented with the price point, which turned out not to matter, but whatever. And essentially, it broke even.
Wow. Jesus. And, that's kind of what I hear a lot of documentarians say, that, if you break even, then that's a win. And also I should mention, for people who don't recognize Rhino, Rhino became Shout Factory, and certainly Shout Factory is a very vital part of pop culture, and have their own streaming channel now, and the like. So yeah, but I've been a Rhino fan ever since I was first aware of them. So yeah. Yeah,
well, they started as a record store in California.
Yep.
In L.A., and then they started putting out records, and then they expanded. and that kind of thing. So
was it being distributed then to record stores as opposed to comic shops and that?
I'm not sure exactly who bought it, but they did a good job.
That's awesome, man. Yeah.
So that was a long time ago. It still has not. There were a couple of times when it threatened to come out on DVD and or Blu-ray, but that hasn't happened.
Okay.
Either. But
Ken, I got to ask because you likely know it is on YouTube.
Yeah.
Are you okay with that? I mean, is it kind of shitty or?
So that's an interesting question. So YouTube has the most backwards policy of copyright, of dealing with copyright.
Please tell me, because honestly, various videos that, without a better definition, you could call them orphan videos, the way there are orphan books, have certainly shown up there. A lot of movies that didn't make it. I mean, I'm watching animated movies like you likely remember Rock and Rule, a Canadian animated movie that kind of followed in the steps of heavy metal. That's there. A lot of Ralph Bakshi's more controversial films are there. Please tell me about YouTube and copyright.
So their policy is, if you see it on there, and you can prove that you're the copyright holder, which I can. I own the thing, 100%.
Yeah.
And it's registered and all that. You fill out a form, you send them proof, and they take it down. They want you to do that every single time somebody puts it up.
Wow.
So after I had done that like 50 times, I finally said, whatever.
Wow.
I
apologize, man. I feel like I'm contributing to your misery.
Not at all. Not at all.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. All right.
I really want people to see it.
Yeah.
And so the thing is, and especially, you're talking about something now, which is like, it's 37 years ago it came.
Yeah.
But I think it's vital and it still holds up.
Of course it is, man. Absolutely it is. Go on.
And so the YouTube alone, probably a couple of 100,000 people have watched it on YouTube.
Absolutely.
And so I love that.
Well, and I can appreciate the bittersweet of that in terms of, hundreds of thousands of people have seen it, but man, if I made what I was supposed to for all those people, I'd be living in a better house right now.
Nah, not everything in life is money, John.
Good for you, Ken. I'm glad. And again, I know the Word Balloon audience certainly appreciates that. And dude, of course this is still vital. I mean, I love the fact that it is 37 years ago. Again, I remember when it was brand new, and just seeing you got all these great people when they were still vital, even as senior citizens were still vital and had something to say, plus all the young bucks like your buddy Bernie, like Frank Miller, like Dave Sim, a young Dave Sim. Yeah. I mean, this is great, but you got Mobius, and you've got, obviously the grand old man himself, Will Eisner.
Yeah.
Kirby, still vital and still full of thoughts and feelings. And again, your buddy Steve Ditko, good Lord. I mean, this is such a great collection. Neal Adams when he's, it's in the mid 80s. I mean, it's so great. And so that's terrific. So making the movie, you get Harlan Ellison to narrate. And Harlan, of course, when he was alive, wonderful advocate of comics, huge fan, nutty as hell. I had my run-ins with Harlan before he passed away, and they were all positive, but really interesting. I had his editor, Diana Schutz, at Dark Horse, and he released a couple of his short stories they adapted into comics, and it was Harlan Ellison's Dream Corridor. And she's like, oh, yeah, we got Volume 2 coming up, and it was in an interview, and this was in the early days of podcasting, and it was great at his message board. People were like, hey, I heard on Word Balloon, Volume 2 is coming up. What's a podcast? I don't even know what that is. And he's, angry as hell. So I wrote to him, and I sent him a copy of the interview, And I said, hey, man, I'd love to talk to you sometime. Well, we'll see. And we never did, but that's okay. But even to get Harlan Ellison's back hair up in Aurora made me like, oh, wow, man, that's awesome. He knows who I am, or at least he's a little aware of who I am. So that was thrilling to me. So how'd you get Harlan, and tell me about that experience? Because I'm sure there's some stories there. Yeah,
it's a great story. So may he rest in peace. You know, absolutely. He was an interesting guy. So my first choice to be the host was Alan Moore.
Wow.
So I wrote a letter to Alan. I didn't have his home address or anything. So I sent it through DC Comics, and in typical DC Comics fashion, they never forwarded him the letter. And when I met Alan in the late 90s, and we spent an afternoon together in London, you know, the first thing I said to him was, you know, why didn't you do Masters of Comic Book Art? And he said, I don't know what you're talking about. And I said, I wrote you a letter through DC, and he said, I never got it.
Wow.
And he proceeded to tell me the greatest story, which is he only came to America once. And when he walked into DC Comics, and I know the room he was talking about because I was in it too many times later, you know, during this Masters of Comic Book Art period, there was a door at one end and then a door at the other end, and there was like a big conference table. And Alan said he walked in the room, and as he came through the door, he saw who he knew was Paul Levitz walk through the other door at the same time. And the first thing Alan said was, I've made the biggest mistake of my life. And Paul Levitz said, no, I've made the biggest mistake of my life. And doesn't that just tell it all?
I guess so, man. Yeah, just two different guys on two different wavelengths. Knowing Paul and what I've seen of Alan and everything, I get it. I guess I get it, yeah. Interesting. Wow.
Alan's a magnificent human being.
I'm a huge fan. No, and I understand as best as you can, for not actually being in the situation, his resentment of the big two. And my analogy is, you know, he made all these amazing things, and of course Watchmen in particular. And it's like being a guy who built the home of his dreams and had a wife, and then divorced, and the wife got the house with the great pool and the beautiful backyard that's so beautifully manicured and stuff. And anytime he talks to one of us, all we want to talk about is that house and that pool. Yeah. And it's just like, yeah, I lost that. Please, can we talk about what I'm doing now? Yeah, but again, the house and the pool, that's so amazing. Yeah. I mean, I always half apologize when I have Dave Gibbons on, who's another Prince, and comes on Word Balloon, and I'm like, you know, I'm sure there's going to be a little Watchmen talk, Dave, but damn it, I do want to talk to you about other stuff, and I don't want you to think the only reason why I talk to you is to have another conversation about Watchmen. Although, again, when the HBO show comes out, it's like, how can you not, you know, help it? And in fact, I even, when the HBO show came out, put out a couple reruns of my talks with Dave, and very sweetly, he's like, hey, John, I'd be happy to talk on the new show if you want to about HBO's Watchmen. I'm like, okay, Dave, that'd be great. I mean, I always want to talk to you, so sure. And we had a lovely, you know, long conversation. So yeah, I mean, no, I understand, and again, I mean, the guy just keeps making brilliant work, his novels and his comics and stuff more, and the same with Dave for that matter too.
They're both great, but Alan is, you know, he's absolutely the best writer that comics will ever have, because what he sees, no matter what he does, is he has the kind of mind which is unique, and I've only met less than a handful of people in my life like this. He sees everything about all of it all at once.
I'm nodding. Yes.
All at once. And he also has a photographic memory, you know, and complete recall, and he feels everything so deeply. And He's unbelievable, and you know. But anyway, so I wanted him to be the host, and can you imagine? I can.
Yeah, no, I understand, man. And again, especially in that period, the few video interviews he did do then are all insightful. I mean, God, The Mindscape of Alan Moore, that wonderful documentary that he made. I mean, no, I get it. And again, could articulate things about comics that, I think the common fan wouldn't consider. But Harlan's a good second choice. But go on if there were others. I don't know.
Well, my second choice. So Bernie. So I was waiting. I couldn't wait anymore. Bernie suggested Stephen King.
Very cool.
And he put me in touch with him. And you know, we talked several times. But the reason Stephen didn't want to do it is because the thrust of my thing was not about EC Comics, number one. Which was Stephen's, you know, love.
Sure.
And secondly, because of where I was going with this whole artistic vision of comics as a language, as its own language, you know, its own unique language.
Yes.
And how you get there. And so that didn't happen. And so finally Dave Sim, who I was friendly with before this, he suggested Harlan.
Okay.
So I called Harlan up, and we talked about it. And, you know, Harlan, of course, had these very grandiose ideas, you know, as he does. And he was like, I did this thing one time on public television about science fiction books, and they made these big, giant covers of these books, and they hung them, and I walked in between them all and talked about it. I'm like, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, man.
I'm like, that's not going to happen. So anyway, he graciously decided that we could do it at his home, Ellison Wonderland.
Yeah.
Which I don't know how much you know about that, but
describe it. I do, but please go on.
Oh, it was magnificent. It was a magnificent home, impeccably imagined as if it was one of his stories, you know, and worked on by chosen craftsmen that had, you know, I think gargoyles as you came in, and it had an underground grotto, and it had library shelves that were 3 stories tall, and you went into where he kept his comic books on stainless steel shelves in a temperature-controlled room.
Wow. Secret rooms as well, am I right?
Secret rooms, yeah, an underground grotto and a few others, and how you ate your meals was designed, and the backyard was designed. It was unbelievable.
That's awesome, man.
Unbelievable. So he let us film in there, and then he was also extremely helpful in getting Frank Miller to actually show up.
That's cool.
You know, because I had spoken to Frank when he lived I think he was living in New York, and when I first talked to him, but then he moved out to L.A., and when I got to L.A., I called him up, and he wasn't calling me back. And, you know, I called him a number of times, and I started panicking because I was only in L.A. for, let's say, a week or so. And finally, you know, I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. So I mentioned it to Harlan, and he's like, I'll take care of it.
Cool.
So that was great as well. But, yeah, everybody was really everybody who ended up being in it was really, fantastic. Kurtzman, I don't think
Talk
Kurtzman...
about Harvey. Yes, please.
Harvey just doesn't get enough credit, I
Damn
think.
straight. Go on, yes.
Unbelievable, totally honest, but what a trend, not even a trendsetter. He changed people's lives.
Yep.
With his work. Yep. And how many people can you say that about,
Yep. Absolutely.
And just a great man. And I brought him to a Grateful Dead concert at Madison Square Garden. I sent a limousine to pick him up. And him and one of his daughters, who I guess liked the Dead, she came and, pulled the limousine right up, to the back, inside the garden to the backstage. We put 2 chairs right on the stage with the Dead.
Wow.
And, so, he could experience it. And when he came off the stage to leave, I met him and took him back to the car, and I said, well, what'd you think of it? And he looked me deep in the eyes and said, the power.
Did Jerry meet him?
Oh, yeah.
That must have been amazing for Jerry. Good Lord.
It was great. Jerry met him, and then not at the same time, but a little bit later, he met Will Elder.
Oh, that's fantastic. Both of them. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Good Lord, man. That's excellent.
So, but Harvey, Harvey just, I don't know. He just doesn't get enough, but people like that mostly don't,
I'm so glad Bill Shelley wrote that extensive biography that he did.
Yes.
And man, I'm still mourning Bill Shelley because I thank God he got his Jim Warren book out. And literally, like an idiot, when it came out, I'm like, oh, I talked to Bill about about his book about now I'm blanking Otto Binder, and I'm like, I gotta get Bill back on to talk about the Harvey book and about the Jim Warren book. I gotta make sure that happens before the end of the year. And I'm in Portland at Rose City Comic Con when he passes away. And I'm just kicking myself. And also, I mean, God, there's a guy that, an unsung fanzine guy like yourself that really, thank God, he has the books that he made before he passed away. Because that's the thing, man. And again, this is an example of your movie as well. A story gets handed down and you lose the truth. And that's the great thing about your movie and Bill's books you're getting it from the horse's mouth. You get it from Harvey Kurtzman.
Don't forget about Bill's. I mean, Bill's fanzine was one of the most, if not the most important, I think, fanzine to come out.
Yes. So,
graphic story.
Okay. I was going to say Sense of Wonder, but that's the collection of essays. So yeah. Okay, graphic storytelling.
No, it was. I'm going to blank on the name for a second, but it was something about graphic.
No worries.
Yeah.
Again.
I think it was Graphic Story Magazine, maybe. But.
Okay. Yeah, people need to go to Amazon, look up Bill Shelley, and really cherry pick anything that interests you, and you won't be disappointed. Because he was a great historian. I'm glad I got my one conversation with him. And I'm sorry that there weren't more because, he was great. He was amazing.
Yeah. He was amazing. He did good stuff. I worked for Warren for a short period.
Oh, wow.
And so I chuckled and laughed all through his book.
It's a great book. And I wonder if beyond that initial printing, because it's out of print, it sold right away. I don't know if Fantagraphics is going to release a second edition or not.
Yeah, Bill Parente, who succeeded Archie Goodwin as the editor and writer of Creepy and Eerie at Warren, he lived in the town that I lived in, Hackensack.
Oh, wow.
And I met him through he was selling tickets for Phil Suling, and I mean he was literally like, I don't know, like a half a mile from my house. So I rode my bicycle down there and knocked on the door, and met him, and had a good friendship with him as well. And he's also underrated. He wrote some good stuff.
What did you do for one too?
Well, I tried to write for him, and I wrote a bunch of stories, and he kept threatening to publish them, and he didn't. And then he in typical Warren fashion, he accused me of either writing Bill Parente's stories or Bill Parente writing my stories.
Crazy.
Yeah, he was out of control. One time he had Frazetta's Egyptian Queen painting in the office.
Okay. Yeah.
And before it was published, and I said, let me take that home and photograph it for my fanzine, and then I'll bring it back. And he let me.
Wow.
How crazy, man. How crazy, right?
Yeah, that's insane. Good Lord.
He was wild. He would do things like at one of the conventions, Suling conventions, he got up on the podium and he said, and I'd like to introduce, and the room was packed, that more people were coming by then. I forget what year it was, early 70s maybe. Okay. And he said, I'd like to introduce my new main writer for Creepy and Eerie. And he announced my name.
Wow.
And told me to stand up. And we hadn't even talked about it.
Oh, Jesus. Wow.
Yeah, he was a card. He was something else. But
back to the documentary. So yeah, Harvey's segment is amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, again, you really, I'm sorry that it wasn't bigger for you, Ken, because because really you hit the iron at the right time in terms of, this was right after Watchmen and Dark Knight and Mouse, and really, as you said, it's funny because what brought me back to comics was, and I'm sure you were aware of it at the time, I'm in college, and Rolling Stone does that great article about Dark Knight and Frank Miller.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no idea that this was happening. And I read the description of the story, and I'm a lifelong Batman fan. Yeah. So I immediately go out at Illinois State University. I go to the local comic store, and I'm like, oh, you have Dark Knight? And thank God they did. And I got the first copy, the first chapter of it, and I was hooked. And then, of course, I saw the pre-advertisements for Watchmen. Mm-hmm. And that looked amazing. And he had a photocopy of the first issue before it came out.
Yeah.
And I guess DC was sending them out to various stores or whatever. And oh my God, so yeah, that really brought me back to comics. Was this Dark Knight Watchmen era? Go on.
The problem, I stopped reading comics in the early '70s when I threw myself into the music business.
Sure.
And there wasn't that much. I still feel there wasn't that much in the '70s. But when independent comics started again towards the end of the '70s or beginning of the '80s, and then some other things were happening even that precedes what you were just talking about. That's when I started reading again. But the problem was that with the companies kind of they didn't have any. So if you read Watchmen or Dark Knight Returns or Mouse, and then you went in and said, I want more of something like this, there was nothing else.
That's right.
So the companies really kind of blew it because, the companies never had any vision, I remember me telling you about the editors, in the beginning, these editors, and I know some of them have good reputations or better than others or whatnot. But you got to remember that these editors were all failed writers.
Sure.
And they were also failed editors, in the book business.
I understand. Okay.
And
yep.
the thing that they would do is they would try to put themselves onto whatever it was.
Oh God, yes.
With no matter who it was.
Right.
And so there's me. I'm a kid, but I understand this, and I see what's happening. And they were trying to keep young people out of the field so hard, and that's another reason that I walked away.
I understand.
Well, things didn't really change much. The great thing about comics is once the era you're talking about, when some of the independents started, and then there was Dark Knight and Watchmen and Mouse, is that so many people came out from seemingly nowhere and said, I want to do comics.
Yep.
It was this fantastic explosion. It was wonderful,
Yeah, that's where the Turtles came from, and you're right, the black and white boom of the '80s.
Yeah.
That sprang alongside Watchmen and Dark Knight and Mouse and things. Or even, I will say this, and again, it's one of the I just talked to him, Mike Gold, who was at First Comics, gets a chance to go back to DC, and I will say that out of Dark Knight, he approaches Mike Grell and says, I want you to do an adult Green Arrow story. And that's where we got Longbow Hunters, which I do think for being a mainstream book was reasonably groundbreaking. It wasn't Dark Knight or Watchmen, but I think at least as a college kid, I felt like, okay, and then that's why I think in the wake, they were, I don't know, a year behind, 6 months behind when those books came out, but something like they recognized something had happened, and I do think in their limited but still editorially controlled way, tried to break the mold and the stupor that comics maybe were in for 15 years after the explosion of the late 60s, early 70s, when Neal Adams was doing Dead Man, as reflected in your documentary and things like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure I totally agree with you that they were trying to do anything than try to catch a wave or jump on a trend.
Okay.
But what they didn't do was take the vital history, the vital and rich history of comics, starting with the great newspaper comics, then going on to the EC things.
Yep.
And take the visionary artists that had worked in the field and build upon that.
No, I hear you.
That was the thing. To take like Jack Kirby, for instance. Jack, if you ever met him, he was bursting, from the inside out in a physical way that then made it onto the page.
Totally. Yeah.
And Ditko with his storytelling sense. Where Ditko didn't even have to put notes in the gutters like Kirby did, for Lee to follow what was happening. You know what I mean?
Yes.
That's the thing. Like you talk about Watchmen. Alan told me that. Alan was like an architect.
Oh God, yes. Go on.
Like I told you, he could see the whole thing, completed, finished at once. And, so he told me one of his proudest things about Watchmen was that he got to use the Kurtzman Elder Mad Comics approach to putting that into the backgrounds and the continuity of Watchmen and all of that kind of thing. That was his proudest part.
That's cool.
Of that. So he built on that stuff.
And even using the 9-panel grid for each page and stuff like that. I mean, you're right. There's a million more things going on in the pages of Watchmen than what's on the surface. And also, it's interesting as newer generations come to it, some of them they don't understand because there's been so many poor imitations that followed that they're like, why was this such a big deal? And
Correct.
it really, and it really does take comic historians to really kind of lay it out for them and go, you got to understand, there was nothing like this. You've seen it's like cover bands. It's like all the wannabes, as you know, from the music business that follow a trend and stuff like that. Yeah, it's and in fact, just had a similar conversation with Howard Chaykin about this yesterday as we're recording this. So, I again, man, I'm a student. I mean, I listen to my experts and let them tell the stories, man.
Yeah, it's like Spiegelman. It's like Spiegelman taking the sensibilities of underground comics and turning it into Mouse.
Indeed, absolutely, man. Tell me about getting Art, because I've had one conversation with Art last summer. It's taken me years to even just get that. And, again, I only got a half hour with him, and I'm like, I can't even scratch the surface talking to you for a half hour, but I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak to you anyway. That guy's such a genius, and I love Raw, everything he does. Did you have a chance to see, and he only did it in a couple cities, he found all these older graphic novels that, were from, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, and a lot of them were silent graphic novels. They were amazing. And they, he's incredible. So, I mean, not only a great creator, but a great historian as well. He's somebody, again, like we're talking about, and what's interesting, I think, is every single person who was in Masters of Comic Book Art fits this. They were all admirers, students of what came before, and figured out how to turn it into something new and original. Agreed.
So that's what Spiegelman was about. He was easy to get. I just called him up, and
okay.
I went to Crumb first. There's two people that I approached that I wanted to be in it that actually talked me out of putting them in there.
Interesting.
And it was a mutual discussion, but Crumb was one, and Steranko was the other one.
I was going to ask why Steranko was absent from the movie. I would love to hear both stories. So please.
Well, they both talked me out of it. Crumb more or less felt that, listen, his story is so complex.
Agreed.
And very tortured as well.
Oh yeah, Terry Weigoff's movie, that documentary, is just brilliant.
I think he's found peace, is what I hear. I don't know whether it's true or not these days, but I hope so.
Yeah.
But he basically, he talked me out of it by saying a lot of what I've done is what I did, but it doesn't kind of fit in with the discussions we were having about, pushing comics forward,
Okay.
As a writer artist,
Uh-huh.
And Steranko similarly, and I knew him from back in the day. We had met several times and had conversations. But he kind of said more or less that what he did, both of them said to me, tell me what I did that was so special.
Okay.
And so I attempted to do that. But after we discussed it, I kind of agreed with both of them that it was a moment in time, for each that was important, but again, did not fit in with these other people,
Okay.
In what they did. So that's the easiest way that I could say it, you know. And
okay.
even Neal Adams, who I also knew from, you know, way before, you know, I did the film, he said the same thing to me. But yet through our discussion, I was able to convince him that what he did do by bringing the sensibilities of the illustrative quality of newspaper comics into monthly comics, you know, and superhero comics, was important and vital, and it was a next step. You know?
Agreed. Yes.
And also in terms of the storytelling. You know, Neal, I think, did what he did storytelling-wise a little bit unconsciously, but as I pointed out to him, it was really important because he took panel arrangements and you know, designs and put it in another place that it hadn't been.
Totally.
Absolutely. So he, you know, agreed to do it. And
that's interesting, though, that Steranko, you know, and again, I guess, like you said, his thoughts convinced you otherwise, because the two of them, kind of hand in hand, were both like the new hot thing, and also the way that Steranko, you know, did mixed media in comics and and his own panel design and ideas and stuff. Like, you know, I always love. He says Ed Brubaker described his Captain America run.
Yeah.
And Steranko laughed and said, "What run? It was 3 issues."
Yeah. Well, I remember buying those comics as they came out on the stand, and you know, I couldn't wait. You know, I think I got in trouble for reading one in school because I used to go pick up the comics when they first came in at 6:00 in the morning, you know, and get them first, you know, and I got in trouble for reading it in class. But I think with Steranko, more so than Crumb for sure, I think because Steranko had so little work, you know, so small a body of work, that and he didn't go on and he didn't build on the potential, which is kind of, you could describe the history of comics as that, but because he didn't build on the potential that small body of work had, that I think he's right in not overstating it, you know.
Interesting. Bendis, my buddy Brian Bendis always says Steranko was the Orson Welles of comics because of that small but vital body of work.
Well, I don't know if I agree. You know, I don't know if I agree with Bendis, because Orson Welles never stopped making movies. He just had trouble. He just had trouble getting them financed.
Right, and finished. No, you're right about that. Absolutely.
But Steranko stopped doing comics.
That's right. Yeah.
You know,
right.
and you know, so I can't agree with Bendis there.
That's all right. Hey, man, no. I appreciate the contrast. That's excellent, man.
Yeah.
What about Mobius? Tell me about getting Jean Giraud.
So Mobius, you know, I was blown away. I had seen, you know, some issues of Metal Hurlant, you know.
Of course.
Even though I can't speak or read French, the storytelling and the science fictional aspect of his artwork, you know, as well as I'd seen some of the Western stuff.
Yeah, Lieutenant Blueberry, I love that stuff. Man.
Yeah, and the storytelling, you know, and the draftsmanship and everything else was just amazing to me. And, you know, then when I think when the epic translations had started to come out,
yes, Epic Illustrated, the wonderful Marvel produced sci-fi anthology. Absolutely, man.
I was just blown away by a half dozen of the major works that he had done. So I wanted to get him. I heard that he was living in California, in Venice. I reached out through his agent, and he agreed to do it.
Wow.
So I went out, and what was interesting about him was, I had been told that, he didn't speak a lot of English, so I should bring a translator along. So I was a little nervous about that aspect. And we went to where he was living at the time. It was a two-family house, and he was upstairs, and his ex-wife was living downstairs.
Wow.
And we went up, and, normally, you'd go in and you'd meet somebody. He stayed at the drawing table drawing comics and didn't even look up. And when it came time to do the interview, he didn't need the translator at all.
No, he sounds great, man. And of course, you could.
I watched him draw page after page of comics. He was lightning fast.
Wow.
He was able to compose a page without thumbnails or thinking about it perfectly. What a mind. And, and he's just, again, during that particular period in which he made those comics that he did, there's still nothing else like them.
Agreed. Absolutely. No, absolutely. So, and are we okay for time? Because, honestly, okay, great, Ken, because honestly, this is all terrific, and I know the fans are hanging on every word and every description that you're giving here.
Cool.
I want to ask about Dave and Bernie as well, so tell me about Dave Sim.
Well, Dave Sim, I had read Cerebus from when it first came out for some reason.
Okay.
The first couple of issues was, were like a parody of Barry Smith's Conan.
Absolutely.
And, I know Barry Smith as well, by the way.
Another genius, yeah.
And another amazing tortured artist. So I read those, and I thought they were funny, but there was something about them that was more than a parody kind of thing. And then as Cerebus started to, not too many issues after that, there was something really compelling about the storytelling and about what he was doing and the possibilities of the story and the kind of behind in the not so obvious intelligence of what it was. And so I reached out to Dave early on, and I think we talked to each other a couple times. Then he came to New York to do a signing where nobody showed up. And I went, and I ended up talking to him for like hours in a comic shop. And he liked music and very bright and very interesting. And we kind of became friends a bit. And so when I went to do this, I asked him, and he was hesitant. And I'm not sure why necessarily. But he said something to me about, well, if you could take me to a really great concert, then I might do it. So him and Gerhard, and you have to mention Gerhard if you mention Dave, because he was great. Really super nice guy too.
All right, I'm ignorant. Tell me about Gerhard. Was that his assistant on
Gerhard
service?
did all the backgrounds.
Oh my God!
From a certain point, and it was a relatively early point. I don't remember which issue it was.
Jesus.
He did all the backgrounds and the covers for all of Cerebus.
I understand now. Sure.
Right through to the end. And Dave I shouldn't say only, he wrote the stories, he penciled the main figures, and he lettered it.
That makes sense because of the contrast of the two art styles of his figures and the backgrounds. That makes a ton of sense. Okay, great.
So, and Gerhard, really, really, like I said, amazing human being.
Oh, great artist too, and you're right about that. And kind of the Bill Finger of Cerebus when you think about it. Then.
Yeah, in a weird way, kind of. But so they were coming to New York, and Eric Clapton was playing a small club in New York. And I also found out that Keith Richards, who I'm friendly with, was going to show up and play.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
And Dave loves Keith Richards.
Oh wow.
And the Rolling Stones, and he loves Eric Clapton. So I said to Dave, "Hey, you're going to be in New York during this time. You come down, you meet me. I'll get you into the show to go see Eric Clapton in this small club, and Gerhard." And so they came, and then of course Keith Richards showed up and played.
That's excellent, man.
Dave found me on the way out and said, "Okay, I'll do it." It's pretty funny story.
That's awesome, man.
But so I went out to Kitchener and interviewed him, and we spent the whole day and evening together. And then there was a really bad snowstorm, and I had sent the crew back to Toronto, which is about an hour away from Kitchener. And, I'm like, how am I going to get back? And Dave ordered a limousine to take me back in a snowstorm. Yeah.
Jesus. That's awesome, man.
Super guy. Great guy. I think that the first 200 issues of Cerebus are amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And I think
the different places the story went, from starting with a parody of Conan and everything, and God, when he became Pope, Church and State.
Yeah.
I mean, all the politics and everything that developed it. No, Cerebus, you can't ignore Cerebus. You can't. It's a very important comic book.
The currency of it all, and and then the last 100 issues are really, really fascinating and interesting, in which he tries to make comics on a par with literature.
Yeah,
it's very, very interesting, and the funny part about all of it is he actually wrote me into a small part of the story.
Wow.
As well, so it's pretty funny. But I felt that Dave represented independent comics in the film.
Yeah.
And the independent comics was a movement that really tried hard to make it, but kind of didn't. And part of it wasn't the fault of the comics. Part of it was that whole distribution fiasco that happened.
In the early 90s when Cap Cities and all of them kind of fell, and Diamond now the monolith that it is, and I'm sure you're well aware of the current state Diamond obviously the whole business right now is on pause.
Yeah.
Because of the virus, and it's a house of cards. Diamond doesn't have money coming in, so they can't pay the stores. The stores don't have new books anyway, so they are kind of fending for themselves. And the smaller publishers are at a standstill. I mean, again, Warner, DC is backed by AT&T, and Marvel is backed by Disney. But again, nobody is impervious. I mean, Disney, good Lord, between the cruises and the amusement parks, that's their money makers. That's their massive money makers. And also not being able to release big movies right now. No, it's a house of cards, and part of it is because of this monolithic distribution and everything.
Yeah, well, you can't have one. And I think Marvel started that ball rolling when they went with
Heroes.
When they went with Heroes, which is from New Jersey, which is where I'm from.
Okay.
But yeah. So, but if you look at independent comics, and I certainly bought quite a few of them, spent a lot of money, but most of the stories were never completed, and the comics weren't finished, and they started out really good and then petered off. But Dave actually in Masters of Comic Book Art, I believe, or thereabouts, announced that he was going to put out 300 issues of Cerebus.
Yep.
And finish it, and he did.
Yes, he did. And it is in the documentary. It's pretty amazing. You're right.
Yeah. And so, I give him a lot of credit for that. And he also tried everything in his power and money out of his pocket to make independent comics happen. And you can point to, okay, there was the Turtles phenomenon. Okay, Jeff Smith, Bone through Scholastic, was a huge success. I'm not sure there's many more, or maybe any more besides that. But Dave, he held up his hand. I think he does it in Masters, and said, I'm the artist, I'm the writer, artist, this hand is all one needs to make this, to make a comic book.
Yeah.
And, I really, I really admire that. I
hear you, man. No, again, like you said, he did it, and Gerhard, obviously a big part of it, but he did what he set out to do, and then he finished. I was following, he had a comic a couple of years ago called Glamourpuss that I was buying, and, I don't agree with, sometimes you have to separate the art from the artist. And,
sure.
David said some controversial things in I don't know, going back how far or whatever. I still find his personal story fascinating, and he started something in Glamourpuss that then he continued and does now, I believe, still on Patreon, the monthly crowdfunding platform that I use for my podcast as well. And, he puts out a couple pages when he can, and you are supporting him monthly as he's kind of making this book, because he's doing this amazing story about the death of Stan Drake and Alex Raymond's involvement in that story and everything. And that's kind of one of those bizarre mysteries. I believe I don't remember if Stan caused the accident or if Alex caused the accident.
It's kind of the other way around.
All right, thank you.
It was the death of Alex Raymond, and Stan Drake was in the car.
Oh, there you go. All right, there you go. I appreciate that. There you go, man. Yeah. No, and also, by the way, you're absolutely right, and I am a complete novice when it comes to the great comic strips, especially the dramatic ones. But I'm a student, and anytime IDW would put out a Rip Kirby collection or Secret Agent Corrigan, some of these great things, I loved reading them. And what you said about Neal coming from comic strips to comics, Neal is selling PDFs of his Ben Casey comic strips on his website, which I think is fantastic that he's doing it. Yeah. And man, even Wally Wood's interesting adult comics that he did for, it was called Canon, and it was kind of a mercenary comic, and it's incredibly inappropriate by today's societal standards. Lots of exploitation, but it's beautifully drawn, and if you can appreciate it in the perspective of, well, this flew back then, I am not ashamed to say that I bought it, and I find it fascinating. The storytelling is incredible, and these masters, the way that they were able to, their storytelling. I mean, that's really the heart of it.
Yeah, well, I think in Dave's case, and I could be wrong about this, but I think in Dave's case, basically, some of what he's accused of is not necessarily altogether true.
Okay.
I think that, I think a lot of his work, the underlying, as I started to say before, part of his work, I think, basically is autobiographical, right?
Yeah.
And I also think that the time in which Cerebus takes place is relevant to, like you said, money, power, religion, gender, all kinds of things.
Yep.
And I think that some of what he's accused is in service to the story.
I'm nodding.
More than his opinion. What I mean?
I do.
So, but whatever, people will think what they think.
Yes.
Regardless, the guy put out 300 issues, basically on time, basically monthly, and completed his independent comic.
Agreed.
That he owned, all by himself. Well,
I agree, man.
With Gerhardt, but all by himself. So
no, you're without editorial interference, and no, I hear you, man. No, one of the more pure independent comic books out there and stuff.
You mentioned Wally Wood, who I met a few times through Ditko, and you look at Wally Wood's EC work, and there's almost nothing like it in the history of comics. Especially if you've ever seen the originals. But Wally Wood was so excited, I remember clearly, when he was putting together the first issue of Wits End.
Oh, yes, is the independent book, yes.
And I remember him saying to me how all the artists are complaining that if there was no editor, if there was better reproduction, if there was, time to, produce something of quality, if I owned it, everything would be great. So I'm going to give them the opportunity to do it. And he was so disappointed that when he did that, virtually nobody responded.
Responded in terms of
producing original work.
Wow.
To go into Wits End. I mean, Ditko responded.
Interesting.
But
all these other people that were complaining, when the time came, they had nothing to offer.
Yeah. So here you go. Do it.
Yeah.
Here it is. Here it is. You'll own it. It's on pure white paper. I remember how bummed out he was.
Interesting.
It was amazing.
Dennis Kitchen and I spoke about a year and a half ago about when his underground comics, and doing the same thing in terms of taking people's stories and, hey, I'll have the rights to them for a year or two. The rights will revert back after that point. Do what you want. And yeah, so, I mean, I've only gotten Dennis's perspective of that early 70s period when he was making underground comics. And, I definitely want to get him back on the show sooner than later to talk more about his period like that. But, I got to confess, I am aware of Wits End, and I've never read any of the collections if they're out there, and I've got to do that because.
Oh, you should.
Absolutely, man. No, yeah, Woody's amazing, and I mean, Keith Giffen was helping him with All Star Squadron back in the early 70s, so I've gotten his Woody stories, and I can't remember any others offhand that have talked about working with Wally and everything, but. Yeah, I mean, that's another tortured genius, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, he went through, his life went through several phases. But, listen, the comic book business, like the music business, they've always been tough businesses.
Yep.
A lot of creative businesses, are. I mean, so we didn't talk about Bernie.
Yeah,
right?
please, because Tim Bradstreet introduced me to Bernie in the early 2000s because Bradstreet and I went to college together. And when I started going to San Diego regularly, I met Bernie. And sweetheart of the guy, and we were going to talk. And, in fact, we were going to be at a convention in Cincinnati together, and that's when he got really sick. Mm-hmm. And, so I missed my opportunity. So tell me about Bernie.
Yeah, Bernie, like I said before, we met when we were kids. It was the first convention he'd come up from where he lived. And kind of a quiet guy, in the beginning, maybe all the way through to an extent, but another guy who studied, and brought it forth, he I guess, somewhere deep inside had some kind of, childhood and was determined not to let that get him down. And through his ability to get it out by drawing horror, brought it to life.
Wow.
His pen and ink work, is unbelievable. And then he started painting, later on. I know he had, some difficulty with that, but he still persevered and did it. When we went to do Masters of Comic Book Art, he was living up in the Woodstock area in Saugerties, and Jeff Jones lived up there. And
wow, cool.
Barry Smith lived up there.
They had the studio together, and Mike Kaluta, right?
Well, the studio was in New York City,
right?
And that was short-lived. And Kaluta, when he came up from where he was from, he lived in New York City and stayed in New York City. He probably still lives there. For all
okay.
But the other three had moved up into the Woodstock area.
I see. Okay.
And when we did Masters, Bernie was working on Frankenstein.
Yeah.
So when I was up there, he was showing me these pages, the originals.
Yes.
Mind blowing.
Oh, I bet.
It took him forever.
Yeah.
To do, and he had a little studio out back that he went and worked in, and he also had a smaller space in the house, and he was living there with his wife and kids, and he was a big Meatloaf fan. He liked the Bad at Hell album, and so when I approached him to do it. The record company was Epic Records, which was owned by Columbia.
Sure, absolutely, man. Yeah.
We were involved in the management of Meatloaf and Jim Steinman, the lyricist.
Yes, you did.
And this guy, John Berg, was the art director, this award-winning art director for Columbia Records. And so when I went to see him, I said, I want to hire Bernie Wrightson. And he said, well, I don't know who that is. He was very gruff. And I showed him a copy of the studio book.
Okay, sure.
Show him examples. And he said, oh, I know this guy. I hired him to do an album cover for me, and he was talking about Barry Smith.
Okay.
And I said, well, that's not the guy I want to show you. Well, that's who I want. And so I said, I really like this other guy, and we actually had it in our contract that we got to choose who it was, not him. But you know how that goes with politics at record companies. And so I called Barry Smith, who I had met, and I said, "Do you want to do this?" And he says, "No, absolutely not." So I said, "Well, do me a favor." I said, I didn't think so, but I really wanted Bernie to do this. And he goes, oh, yeah, Bernie'd be great. And, he likes meatloaf. And I said, yeah. I said, do me a favor. Call this idiot, John Berg, and, tell him that you can't do it, but Bernie would be great. Or tell him you'll help Bernie do it. Or
sure.
Something,
Right.
And he goes, okay, no problem, because, And so he calls him. So John Berg calls me up, and he goes, well, Barry Smith and Bernie Wrightson are going to do this thing together. And I'm like, did he say that? And I said, because he told me he didn't want to do it. so he said, well, I said, okay, good. So it's a done deal, whatever. So what happened was, so Bernie did the cover, and we talked about it. And Bernie was having just a little tiny bit getting the C right. The C is on the bottom, and Meatloaf is holding this Meatloaf flag with these, beautiful women or mermaids or whatever it is. And so I said, oh, so let's take the painting over to Barry Smith's house, and Barry can help you with the waves, and then I can tell this guy from Columbia Records that Barry, worked on the thing. Anyway, so that's what we did, and the cover came out great, and everybody was happy, and Bernie was a pleasure to work with, as always, and like you said, great guy, fantastic. Yeah. I loved him dearly from the moment I met him. And one of, if not the best horror artists in comics.
Certainly one of. I mean, again, the EC guy certainly blazed the trail, but I would certainly say best of his era. And I mean, my God, if it was only Swamp Thing, would be significant enough. But as you point out, Frankenstein, and I'm so glad Steve Niles got so much work with Bernie before Bernie passed. And it seemed that at least Bernie was working and putting things out and a big part of comics again, which was why I was so pleased to meet him through Tim and then subsequent conversations with either Tim and Bernie or Steve and Bernie. So yeah, man, I like I said, I only had a couple brief encounters with him, but he was always incredibly kind. And he's like, oh yeah, we'll do it. And I'm like, okay, man, no problem.
So the thing about, like you mentioned, and you're probably talking about sort of like Graham Ingalls, So you look at his stuff, and it's in your face, right? But Wrightson had this subtlety to his art that was more horrific, I think.
Agreed.
That allowed you to sink in to what it was, and then when it had you in its grip, it didn't let go. And the other thing was he's not as well known for his storytelling, but his storytelling in comics and the things he created in comics himself, they're amazing.
Yeah.
They're amazing. You know, in a narrative, in a true comic book language way. And he should be known more for that stuff, you know, as well. Everybody likes the illustrative aspect, you know, to what he did, but he loved comics, you know.
Well, and you know, his monologue in your piece, kind of speaks to, like you said, that subtlety that he was going for. So no, I understand what you're saying. Absolutely. Did they all? I mean, because again, they were all presented as monologues rather than a back and forth. So how are you guiding their monologues?
So I wrote down some basic interview questions that were tailored to each of them specifically, and I interviewed them at length, and then I cut what I wanted into the monologue.
Do you still have your masters of the? Ken, you got it. I mean, this is you know, again, and I believe me, I'm sure it's a Herculean task to do this, but I'm sure you've got hours of incredible conversations with these guys, and that you could likely make a, I don't know, you know, either a series or whatever. I mean, is there any thought to that?
No, I haven't thought about it. You know, I still have the tapes. They're in good shape. We shot on beta, which is
awesome.
Good.
Of course you did. Well, that was the better. I mean, that's the shame of VHS and beta. Is beta was really the better quality of videotape.
Yeah. So I did let the Kirby collector. The only interview that I transcribed, and some of them were way longer than others. You know, they varied in length. But I did let the Kirby. I transcribed my Jack Kirby interview, and let the Kirby collector print it in one of the
online.
Interviews.
That essay is online. That transcription is still online.
And I'm really proud of that. You know, we didn't talk that much about Jack.
Yeah, please, man.
When I called Jack, again, after decades, it was like I talked to him yesterday. You know.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Did you go to his house?
Yeah.
Was Roz there, his wife?
Yeah, she was there. Yep. So, yeah, I think when I called, I had to talk to her first.
Sure.
And, you know, and then she said, and I had never met her. And she said, I insisted that she, you know, mention my name to Jack. And, you know, then when she did, he was like, oh yeah, you know, put me on.
Cool.
So we went out he lived in, at the time, in Thousand Oaks, California, I believe.
Yep.
And he lived at the top of this mountain, and his house, where his studio was, had this big, huge window, and then there was a pool and a cliff and this valley, and you could see the next mountains on the other side of the valley from his studio. Yeah, it was wonderful. And he was super happy, you know, and it was such a pleasure. You know, his interview wasn't as long as I wanted it to be, because if you know Jack, you know, it's like I was saying, you know, everything was inside of him, you know, fighting to get out in a physical way. So he, you know, he often, and, you know, because of, I guess, how he was raised and, you know, his background and what he went through and everything, he wasn't always super articulate, So it was hard for him. He would go off on tangents and things.
Okay.
And then Roz would say, "Okay, enough of that, Jack. Answer the guy's question." and I say that in the kindest possible way.
I understand.
But he was amazing. He was amazing. He unfortunately, he never got the credit that he deserved.
Agreed.
In
his lifetime, yeah, or at least not till the end.
Arguably, him and Ditko created the Marvel universe.
Absolutely.
As we know it today.
Yes.
And, I was around Stan a bit, not a lot. And I can tell you that he did not create it.
Interesting. No, and John Romita Sr., another important cog in the wheel.
Yeah.
And it is interesting. And again, taking nothing away from what Stan did. Because obviously, but it's interesting to see. And another guy we didn't talk about, and before we do, I hope we will, Will Eisner. Will Eisner, in that great book of conversations between him and Frank Miller that Dark Horse put out, I always found it interesting that Eisner described Stan Lee's greatest strength as a promoter. Yes.
Yeah. In terms of marketing, in terms of capturing the spirit of the youth, and running with it, Lee did that. But, going back to what we've been talking about with these writer-artists and comic book language, Ditko and Kirby brought these pages in that were completed.
Yes.
The story was done. The characters were delineated. They were
fleshed out. Yeah.
They were fleshed out. They were, all of that stuff. And that's the comic book language. Is one being able to do that, and I say one, person. Eisner was an interesting character. I think that he learned very, very early on to stay arm's length from the comic book business.
Yep.
And be more than that, So he was a canny guy. He was kind of fancied himself more of an accepted artist in the sense of the work world who happened to do comics.
So higher-minded than just comics, or?
Yes, higher-minded. Okay. Even though comics is what he did. Like, for instance, when I met him in New York City to do Masters, we met at a gentleman's club in Midtown Manhattan.
Was it a titty bar gentleman's club, or was it No. It was a real gentleman's club. Forgive me.
Yes, no, not a. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I'm with you now. No. I just wanted to make sure that you were talking about kind of like the Friars Club for comedians and things like that.
Right. So I'm just trying to paint a picture of what he was about and what he was like. And then so we met there and we talked for a little while, and then I took him downtown to a video studio where we did the interview.
Okay.
So we did the interview, and it's fairly long, and I was trying to center it more on a contract with God, and what was was Life on Another Planet?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
That one, and some of the things like that, more so. But I think he kind of wanted to talk more about, the spirit,
sure.
As well. So we talked about that, and we got done, and I said, how was that? Was that okay? And he said, well, it was a lot more in depth than I thought it was going to be.
Oh, that's good. There you go.
So that was very sweet of him.
Yeah.
But he, and I think he talked a little bit about it in the film, that a lot of his comics he developed from taking the sensibilities of a stage play and putting it into comic book form, comic book language form.
Sure.
In terms of lighting and, stage directions and characters and, sound and all of that. So, that I think is, his uniqueness. Certainly in the 10 artists who were in the film, and perhaps in the form itself, there's that. Because, when you talk to a lot of comic book artists, and I'm not talking about the ones who are in the film, they talk about, how much they take or they took from movies.
Yes.
Like I forget who it was told me that I can't remember who, but that when Citizen Kane came out, they went to see it. The whole studio went to see it every day for like weeks.
Wow.
To study it.
To study the storytelling, sure.
Yeah. And now, I think, in comics, just to bring it full circle, I think a lot of comics now are presented as film on, paper.
Yeah. Sure.
But, again, that's not the magic to me. The magic to me is the comic book language is so unique and so special. It's the only form, if you read a book, you're taking words that the author gives you, and you're imagining via the descriptions what's happening.
Right.
What the characters look like, et cetera.
Sure.
And movies, or even TV, you sit there and you let it all go by you.
Yes.
Right?
That's right.
And you're just a participant. Comic book language, when it's done correctly, you're an equal participant in moving what's happening along. You're given words and you're given pictures, but you're also the third party, so to speak, in how that flows.
Yes.
It's the only art form that has that.
Agreed. Yeah. No, you're right. Neil Gaiman talks. Scott McCloud wrote books about that, as did Eisner, and Neil Gaiman always said that for the people that look down on comics, they don't realize that you're using both halves of the brain by looking at the images, reading the story, and as you say, dictating the pacing of how that story hits you. And absolutely, no, you're 100% right, man, and that's what's kept me, enjoying comics, and especially the better ones. And no, I'm totally with you, man.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I mean, I think that a lot of people can't read a comic because they look at it and they don't know where to start.
Yes. Absolutely. What do I look at first? How do I can tell you, non-comic readers that I've shown books that's sometimes the initial question. How do I read this?
Yeah.
And isn't that interesting? Especially given the likelihood, and maybe not anymore, but I mean, you and I were of generations that learned how to read by looking at the funnies and sitting with our parents. And that's how I learned how to read. Definitely. I'm assuming you were the same way.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's that's very interesting. I also think the evolution of the studios becoming aware of the storytelling in comics and trying to translate that into the passive television and films that they've made, really focusing more on the characters themselves and the basics of the stories. It's a very interesting time. And I think also, and you might agree, especially given the people that you spoke to, and this is another thing that Harlan and I were talking about, and also Mike Gold a couple days ago, that the outlaw aspect of comics, there's really a division between the DC and Marvel product and the smaller publishers, and then right down to the underground people. They're all, as Jonathan Hickman told me, they're all on the same shelf, but they're there for different reasons.
Yeah, I just, the thing about comics is that, we discussed before how, the writers, have dominated. But, I think, once Alan Moore decided to go back to the origins of comics,
mm-hmm.
for the last amount of work that he did, and now everybody else has followed that. So you have, crime comics now, horror, pulp,
yep.
All of that, which is kind of full, bringing it back to its origins, the beginnings. It's interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see, what's next.
Agreed.
Well,
and it's certainly out of this current shut-in status quo that we're all kind of suffering from. What shakes out of it, and I've been literally since the beginning of March, I've been having these conversations almost on a daily basis with creatives, and it's run the gamut of, worst case scenarios, and also thoughts of, in tough times, that's when some of the best creative stuff is generated. So,
sure.
And again, man, this is why I'm having these conversations, is to keep the culture of comics going while everyone is on pause, and hopefully entertaining people with conversations like this. So,
that's great, man. It's wonderful. It's wonderful that you do what you do.
Thanks, Ken.
In that way, because I remember back to when there were fanzines, and you waited for them to come in the mail, and
yeah, man.
And it was interesting in those days. You really had to love it, and by doing what you do, obviously you really love it, and it's important to not just be marketing or promotion, but to have serious, meaningful dialogues with people, and to put it out there so that something new can grow out of it.
I appreciate that, man, honestly. And again, in the 80s, when you were making your documentary, I had things like the Comics Journal and Amazing Heroes and Comics Interview, David Anthony Kraft's fantastic book. And they were beyond marketing, just kind of what was going on in the creators' minds as they were putting this stuff out. So, no, I really appreciate that. And also, as you were talking about Epic and Meatloaf as the final thought, God, again, I spent 10 years in rock radio working at XRT from 1990 to 2000, And it was really, an education. And I saw the business shift from the power of the record labels to Napster really kind of, upsetting the apple cart. And now, again, the live performance and bands really having to, that's the main moneymaker for bands these days. And now, God, labels are, just another, hell, I don't even know if they actually have an office anymore in the conglomerates that swallowed all these great labels up. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is, part of that is what's happened, overall in America and or the world as far as the nationalization, globalization, corporatizing, all of that.
Six companies.
About. But
six major conglomerates pretty much control media. 6. That's insane.
Yeah.
But here we are,
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is what it is. But, it's funny that, again, you go back to a person or persons that can create this comic book that is unique or could be unique or should be unique, that can change lives, and that's what it's all about.
Well, and like you said, Dave Sim pointing out that one hand could really change things.
Yep.
And yeah, no, I agree. And again, this is why I like thinking still of comics as an outlaw media that could still, upset a few apple carts and get people thinking and talking and stuff. And really, man, your film is wonderful. I'm glad it's out there on YouTube for people to see, and I'm glad you're, okay with that as long as people get a chance to see it. So it's been great talking to you, man. I really appreciate this conversation and where it went, and your efforts even then, 37 years ago, to make people aware. And we're still trying to fight the good fight in terms of, people reminding people how great this medium is and the kind of amazing storytelling.
Yeah, well, it affected me, so much. And, so when I got the opportunity, the first thing I could think of is, I got to do something about that, So that's why I did it.
And you achieved it, man. So seriously, the Masters of Comic Book Art from 1987. You can see it on YouTube. We've been talking to Ken Viola, the man behind it. And seriously, man, thank you very much. Really, really appreciate you reaching out. I'm glad we had this conversation. And thank you for your contribution to the comics culture.
Okay, thank you so much.
That's Ken Viola. Make sure you join us tonight for a look at Masters of Comic Book Art. Watch it on YouTube today, and then join us tonight for a conversation with Mike Cronenberg and Tom King as we discuss the film. We also get into a little Columbo talk because it's something that Mike, Tom, and I wanted to discuss, and it seems to also have gotten people buzzing about that discussion. So 2 neat topics for tonight's Word Balloon live stream, Thursday night, April 16th. If you missed it, then you can surely catch it on my YouTube channel. That's where you can find it, or my Facebook page under my name, John Suntress. Those are the 2 places it'll be streaming live, and will be posted after the fact as well. So check that out tonight on Word Balloon. And thanks to Ken for a great conversation. We learned a lot today about the creators that he features in that fine documentary. I hope you enjoyed today's discussion today. It was all brought to you by my friends, my League of Word Balloon listeners, capes and domino masks in hand. I appreciate their support, and I thank you for enjoying what I'm trying to do here at Word Balloon and supporting the product through subscriptions at Patreon. Is Word Balloon worth $1 a month to you? Is it worth the price of a comic book a month to you? If you don't have the money, and I know we're all facing a lot of tough times, I am not alone at this. I don't want you to spend money you don't have. But if you enjoy it and you can swing $1 a month or $3 a month, that'd be great. Go to patreon.com/wordballoon. And you can subscribe there, and I will send you your domino mask and cape via email. But I thank you greatly for your support, League of Word Balloon listeners. I also thank Aftershock Comics for their support, because, again, these are tough times, and I'm happy to let you know that while you're looking for good distractions to help you entertain yourself and read interesting things, that's where Aftershock comes in with genre-bending ideas that are worthy of your attention. From great creators, too, like my buddy Tim Seeley or my buddy Colin Bunn, Phil Hester, Marguerite Bennett, Stephanie Phillips, Matthew Klickstein, Lots of great creators. Over the years, Paul Jenkins and Brian Azzarello have created comics for Aftershock and are worthy of your attention. So many great stories from Garth Ennis are waiting for you with the Aftershock brand. Go to their website. You'll find full story descriptions, preview pages, and the diamond codes on how to order these books through your local shop at AftershockComics.com. Next up on Word Balloon, I will bring you that live discussion that we had with Mike and Tom King about Masters of Comic Book Art in Colombo. I will also have a great conversation with Patrick Schumacher, one of the showrunners of the Harley Quinn animated series that is fantastic. Oh my God, it's so good. I'm streaming it on DC Universe. You should check it out. It's also available for purchase either per episode or seasons at Amazon and iTunes. It's a great discussion, and I'll tell you, Kaylee Kuko and Lake Bell are bringing new dimensions to Harley and Ivy, and all the different DC villains and heroes that are portrayed in the series are hilarious. It's a very funny show, well written, well drawn, and well acted, and it's worthy of your attention, and you'll definitely feel the same way after you hear this discussion that we have with Patrick Schumacher, one of the showrunners of Harley Quinn, the animated series. Until then, thanks for listening. Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2020. Stay safe and healthy.